Good evening and welcome. Before we begin, take a moment to settle yourself wherever the evening has found you. Dim the lights if you like. Let your hands rest and let your breathing slow to whatever pace it prefers when nobody is asking anything of it. Nothing tonight will ask anything of you either. There is no test at the end, nothing to remember, and no wrong way to listen. Some of you will stay for the last word, and some of you will be asleep in 20 minutes, and the story will go on just the same either way, like a river that does not mind who watches it. Tonight's story is a little different from the ones we usually tell beside this fire. It is not at its heart the story of a family, though a famous family will walk in and out of every chapter. It is not the story of a place, though it is soaked in one place, the island of Manhattan, from the mud streets at its southern tip to the towers that came after. Tonight we are going to follow the money itself. We are going to sit with a single great fortune, by some accounts the first truly great American fortune, and watch how it was actually made, dollar by patient dollar. We will watch how it compounded for 100 years while its owners slept, by a mechanism so quiet that most of the people living inside it never fully understood it. And then we will watch it dissolve just as quietly, without a thief, without a crash, without a single villain anywhere in the story, until the name remained and the money was gone. The name on the ledger is Astor. For about a century, to say that name in New York was simply to say money. The family was called the landlords of New York, and sometimes only half in jest, New York's royal family. We will meet them as we go. The fur clerk with the flutes, the silent son who doubled everything, the queen of the ballrooms, the one who traded America for a castle and a title, the gentleman on the great ship, the boy who inherited the world, and the small, bright woman who gave it all away with both hands. But tonight, they are the illustrations, not the subject. The subject is the fortune itself, how money of that size breathes and grows and fades. Everything is real, as best as history can tell it. The numbers are the record's own, rounded gently and flagged where they are estimates. And it asks nothing of you except that you listen for as long as you care to. So, let us begin as all fortunes begin with an idea. We tend to picture a fortune as a pile, coins in a vault, a number written in a bank book. But a fortune of the size we are visiting tonight is not a pile at all. It is closer to a living thing. It eats and breathes. And if it is well designed, it grows while everyone attached to it is doing something else entirely, sleeping, dancing, crossing oceans, quarreling about wallpaper. The owner's age and the fortune does not. And like living things, great fortunes have a natural history. Watch enough of them, across enough centuries, and the same three motions appear, in the same order, nearly every time. The first motion is the gathering. This is the part the stories love, the founder, the risk, the empty-handed arrival. The gathering is fast and dangerous, and it almost always happens inside a single lifetime, because it requires a particular kind of person, hungry, watchful, tireless, indifferent to comfort, and that kind of person is rarely produced twice in the same family. The second motion is the compounding. This is the part the stories skip, because nothing appears to happen. The fortune sits. Income arrives, expenses leave, and the difference is folded quietly back into the principal, year after year, decade after decade, the way snow deepens on a roof at night. Compounding asks nothing of its owners except the one thing that turns out to be hardest, that they leave it alone. A fortune in this stage grows best, strangely enough, while the family sleeps. Which is why the great compounding fortunes tend to belong to quiet families, and why the loud ones so seldom last. The third motion is the dissolving, and it is the gentlest of the three and the most misunderstood. Great fortunes are almost never lost the way stories lose them, in a crash at a card table to a swindler in the night. They dissolve the way ice leaves a pond in spring. Divided among heirs. Shaved by taxes. Warmed imperceptibly by inflation. thinned by new laws and old buildings. Each year the change is too small to see, and all the years together are sufficient. No villain is required. Arithmetic is enough. Gathered by concentration. Kept by patience. Lost by division. That is very nearly the whole natural history of money, and tonight we will watch every phase of it play out in a single specimen, the oldest of the great American fortunes, and one of the purest ever grown. Its founder stepped off a ship in the early months of 1784 into a republic almost as new as its own peace treaty. He had sailed from London in November, and by the time his ship reached the Chesapeake Bay, the water was freezing around the hull, and she sat locked in the ice for weeks within sight of land. He was 20 years old, a butcher's son from a small village called Waldorf in the hills of southern Germany near Heidelberg. He had spent a couple of years in London, working for an older brother who made musical instruments, and so nearly everything he owned, the family story says, was a small consignment of flutes, 7 of them, in the usual telling, which he intended to sell in New York. That and a few dollars, and one other thing. On the long passage over, the story goes, he had fallen into conversation with a fellow passenger, a man who had traded furs on the American frontier, and who passed those idle, icebound weeks explaining the business to a young man who never in his life forgot a useful fact. His name was John Jacob Astor. He spoke rough English all his days and wrote it worse. And within 40 years he would be, by most accounts, the richest man in America. The first motion, the gathering, begins in the back room of a fur shop among the pelts. Let us open the fur ledger. To understand the first Astor money, you have to understand a hat. For the better part of 2 centuries, from the age of Elizabeth to the age of Napoleon and beyond, nearly every gentleman in Europe wore a hat made of felted beaver fur. Not fur on the outside the way we might picture it, the soft underfur, shaved from the pelt and worked into felt, dense and smooth and nearly indestructible. A good beaver hat held its shape in rain, lasted for decades, and was handed down in wills. And every single one of them began as an animal in a cold North American river, which meant there was a chain, one of the longest supply chains of its age. A trapper in the interior. A trading post where pelts were exchanged for goods. A merchant in Montreal or New York. A ship. A broker in London. A hatter. And at every link of that chain, a margin, a little profit skimmed as the pelt moved from the river to the gentleman's head. The lesson young Astor absorbed was the simplest one in commerce. The man who owns one link makes a living. The man who owns every link makes a fortune. He started at the bottom, beating dust and moths out of stored pelts for a Quaker fur merchant in New York at a few dollars a week, and learning to grade a prime winter skin from a shabby summer one. Soon he was walking upstate himself with a pack of trade goods on his back, up the Hudson Valley and into the Mohawk country, buying skins one small bundle at a time. In 1785 he married Sarah Todd, a boarding house keeper's daughter with a $300 dowry, and, as it turned out, one of the best eyes for fur in New York. She judged pelts, kept the books, and ran the business whole while he traveled. He is said to have joked, years later, that her judgment was worth $500 an hour to him, and everyone who knew them believed it. Their first shop sold musical instruments and furs out of the same small storefront, flutes in the window, beaver skins in the back. Then, link by link, he climbed the chain. He stopped buying through middlemen and went to the source. When a treaty opened the Canadian trade to Americans in the 1790s, he was in Montreal buying at wholesale. He bought his own ships, so the freight margin became his. And then he reached for the far end of the chain, China, because in Canton, furs could be traded for tea and silk, and a single ship, going out loaded and coming home loaded, could earn on both legs of the voyage. By some accounts, a good round trip doubled the money it carried. He was no longer in the fur business exactly. He was in the margin business, and he was collecting nearly all of them. In 1808, he gathered all of it under one name, the American Fur Company, chartered in New York with $1 million of capital, which was in effect simply him. And once, just once, he bet too grandly. He conceived a continental scheme, a chain of posts stretching west to a fortified settlement at the mouth of the Columbia River on the Pacific, to be called Astoria, his own name on the far edge of the map. And then the War of 1812 arrived. A British warship was rumored on its way, and his partners on the ground sold the whole enterprise to a Canadian rival for a fraction of its cost. It was the one great defeat of his life, and he took from it a rule he never broke again: never bet the fortune on a single throw. Decades later, he paid the writer Washington Irving to tell the story in a book called Astoria, so that even his defeat in time returned a small dividend in fame. After the war, the gathering resumed, harder. A friendly act of Congress barred foreign traders from American territory. He had lobbied for it, because law, too, is a business tool. And through the 1820s, his company came to dominate the fur country of the Great Lakes and then the Missouri, buying out rivals or underselling them until they sold. At his posts, prices ran both ways. Pelts were bought cheap and goods were sold dear, and the trappers, more often than not, ended each season owing the store. And it must be said plainly, even at this quiet hour, that the ledger had a far side. The trade ran on the labor of native trappers, was paid too often in whiskey against every law that forbade it, and it emptied the beaver from rivers their peoples had known for 1,000 years. That debt was never entered in the company's books, and it belongs in any honest telling of this fortune. Then, in 1834, at about 70 years old, he did the thing that separates the great fortunes from the merely large ones. He left. Fashion was turning. Gentlemen in Paris and London were beginning to wear hats of silk, and the price of beaver was sagging, and the streams were thin. He sold the American Fur Company, whole, while it still commanded a good price, and walked away from the business of his life without a backward glance. A monopoly he had grasped is a lease from circumstance, and the trick is to leave it before it leaves you. Besides, for 30 years, quietly with the fur profits as they came, he had been buying something he trusted far more than fashion. He had been buying dirt. Here is the second mechanism of the fortune, and it may be the single best investment idea anyone has ever had. Buy the path of the future at the price of the present. And then do the hardest thing in the world, which is nothing at all. Picture the island of Manhattan at the turn of the 19th century. The city, the actual city, the streets and wharves and churches, occupied only the southern tip, a dense little seaport of about 60,000 people. Everything north of that was country. Farms, orchards, ponds, marshes, a scattering of villages, lanes wandering between stone walls. A gentleman kept a summer house an hour's ride from his counting room and called it the country. But an island is a peculiar thing. A city on a plain can grow in any direction, and its land is never scarce because there is always more of it just beyond the edge. A city on an island can grow in only one direction. New York could only go north. And its population, as the new century opened, was doubling roughly every 20 years, ships arriving, the harbor pulling the commerce of a continent through one narrow gate. In 1811, the city's commissioners published a plan that drew the future right onto paper. A grid of numbered streets ruled across the whole island, up through the farms, all the way to 155th Street, through countryside where the surveyor's stakes stood in cow pastures and orchard grass. People laughed at it, and the laughter, as it does in these stories, faded. Astor did not laugh. He read the map the way he had once read the fur chain, and he began steadily to buy the land the city had not reached yet. Not the finished streets at the tip of the island where prices were already citified, the farms beyond the edge at country prices. He bought the Eden Farm, an estate of meadows, and an old farmhouse along the road that became Broadway, for by some accounts roughly $25,000. land that lies today beneath Times Square. He took over the long lease of Richmond Hill, the country estate of Aaron Burr, when Burr's affairs were in ruin, and cut the elegant hill into hundreds of ordinary building lots. Farm by farm, parcel by parcel, a meadow here, a swamp there, always just past the line where the pavement stopped, he assembled over 40 years one of the largest private holdings of city land the world had seen. And then he waited, and the city did the work. You could watch the wager paying off from the top of any horse-drawn omnibus, the paving crews pushing north, the lots filling in, the farmhouses coming down for row houses, the horse cars running a little farther up the island every few years, past fields that had a street number now and a price to match. Land he had bought by the acre was selling within a generation by the front foot. The growth of the city was a tide, and his whole method, reduced to one sentence, was to buy ahead of the water. The record keeps its honest shadows here as well. In the panic of 1837, when credit collapsed and half the city could not pay its debts, the Astor office bought up distressed mortgages and, where the borrowers failed, foreclosed and kept the lots. It was lawful, it was common, and it was cold, and the fortune grew measurably in those hard years, which is worth saying, gently, because compounding has seasons when it feeds on other people's winters. By the 1840s, the wager had made him, by most accounts, the richest man in the country several times over. And near the end of his long life, he is said to have remarked, and every history of New York repeats it, because it is either true or perfectly deserved, that if he could live his life again, knowing what he now knew, he would buy every foot of land on the island of Manhattan. But the land itself was only half the design. The other half, the engine that turned all that quiet dirt into an income no one could spend, was a piece of financial machinery so simple, so unglamorous, and so nearly perfect that it deserves a chapter entirely to itself. It was called the ground lease. And it is how a fortune earns money while its owners sleep. Let us slow down and take this mechanism apart, unhurried, piece by piece, because once you see how it works, the whole rest of the night, the ballrooms, the castles, the towers, follows from it as naturally as water running downhill. A ground lease works like this. The Astor estate owns a lot, a rectangle of Manhattan earth, 25 feet wide, 100 feet deep. It does not build on it. Building costs money, buildings burn, buildings age, tenants complain, roofs leak. Instead, the estate leases the bare land, typically in that era for 21 years, to a tenant. A carpenter, say, or a grocer, or a small landlord of ambition. The tenant then builds on the lot at his own expense, his house, his shop, and pays the estate a modest yearly sum called ground rent, simply for the privilege of standing there. Now watch what happens at the end of the 21 years, because this is where the quiet genius lives. The lease expires. The land is appraised again, and it is no longer the same land, because the city has spent 2 decades growing up around it. The pavement has arrived, the horse-car line runs past the corner, and the lot that was worth a few $100s at the edge of the fields is worth thousands in the middle of a neighborhood. The estate offers the tenant a renewal at a new ground rent figured on the new value. If the tenant cannot pay, the lease ends, and the building he paid for stands on land he does not own, and it passes, sometimes for a negotiated fraction of its value, sometimes for nothing, to the estate. Consider gently the shape of that bargain. The tenant carries every burden, the cost of building, the repairs, the fire risk, the search for subtenants. The estate carries a ledger. The tenant's years of effort improve a neighborhood, and the improvement flows into the value of land he will never own. The city grows, the rents rise with it, and the estate's entire labor from one year's end to the next is a clerk, an inkwell, and a strong box. That was the engine. Multiply it now by thousands. By the middle of the century, the Astor estate held lots beyond convenient counting, under houses, under shops, under stables and churches, and it must be said, under some of the most crowded tenement blocks in the city, and 4 times a year, on the quarter days, A river of small sums ran downhill into one office. The family did not manage buildings. Mostly, the family did not manage anything. The money compounded, was collected, was lent, was folded into more land, while its owners quite literally slept, and the machine asked of them only the one thing the founder had commanded: do not sell. The son who inherited the machine obeyed it perfectly. William Backhouse Astor, the old man's second son, was as quiet as his father had been hungry. A heavy, silent, methodical man who walked to the estate office every morning of his life, knew every lot on the books by heart, added to the pile, by some accounts, some 700 buildings, and gave the newspapers nothing whatever to write about for 30 years. The city called him the landlord of New York, and it did not entirely mean it kindly. Under him, the ground under the tenements grew steadily more valuable, and the estate collected at the top of a chain whose bottom was immigrant families in 2 airless rooms. A fact worth naming honestly here, once without a sermon, because those rents are inside every number in the rest of this story. If you spent an earlier evening with us among the Vanderbilts, you may notice how strange this fortune is beside that one. The Vanderbilt money roared. Steamboats, railroads, price wars, an empire that had to be run every single day by a man of force and that began to fade the moment no such man appeared. The Astor money ticked. Of the 2 designs, the quiet one proved far more durable. A fortune that requires greatness fails when greatness skips a generation, and greatness always eventually skips a generation. A fortune that requires only stillness can be tended by anyone at all. The city told a story about the founder in his last years, that old and frail, wrapped in blankets, barely able to rise, he still asked his agent each morning whether a certain woman's rent had been paid, and would not rest until it was. The story may be polished. Most stories about him are, but nobody who knew the man ever called it unlikely. He died the end of March 1848 at 84. And then, as always in these stories, came the counting, and with it the largest inheritance America had ever seen. The estate of John Jacob Astor came to roughly $20 million. The number needs a moment of quiet, because 20 million is a small figure by our standards and an almost unimaginable one by the standards of 1848. This was a country where a skilled workman earned about $1 a day. $20 million was, by some accounts, a meaningful share of all the money then circulating in the United States, the sort of sum that had simply never belonged to one private person here before. America had produced rich merchants before. It had never produced this. By most reckonings, John Jacob Astor's was the first great American fortune, the one the others would be measured against. And one famous editor, in the days after the death, wrote something that has followed the fortune ever since. Half of that money, he argued, belonged by rights to the people of New York, because it was the city's own growth, the labor and arrival and building of hundreds of thousands of ordinary people, that had turned Astor's farmland into gold while he slept. It was meant as an accusation. It was also, as we have seen tonight, a perfectly accurate description of the machine. The fortune's engine was the city itself. The estate had merely owned the ground the city happened to need. The will, when it was read, contained one surprise for the public, a bequest of $400,000 to build a public library, the Astor Library, the first great institution of its kind in the city, free to any reader who walked in. We will meet that library again at the very end of tonight's story, so keep it somewhere warm. The rest of the will was not a surprise at all. It was a design. There was a gentle provision, first, for the eldest son who had been born with infirmities the age had no help for. A house, an income, care for life, handled with a discretion the family maintained ever after. And then the great bulk of the fortune, the land, the leases, the machine, passed intact to the second son, William, the quiet one, bound about with trusts and life estates, so that much of it could not be sold even on a foolish day, because the founder had thought of foolish days. And with it passed the rule: It was not written as a commandment, but every generation received it as one. Never sell the land. Rents may be spent, land is not touched. Buy when you can, lease always, and pass the ground itself, whole to the next name in the line. In the language we have been using tonight, the fortune was to be all engine and no exit. Each Astor was to be not an owner, but a steward, a trustee of a machine built to outlive him. One does not so much inherit a fortune like that as get inherited by it. As arithmetic, the rule was very close to perfect. Manhattan land in the 19th century was the best performing asset on earth, and refusing to sell it meant refusing to interrupt the compounding, while sparing every generation the one thing that ruins heirs, which is decisions. William tended them 27 years and did exactly what the design asked of him, which was very little superbly. When he died in 1875, the fortune had roughly doubled to somewhere near $50 million, and the newspapers noted, almost with frustration, that he had managed this without doing anything anyone could describe. That was the whole point. The fortune had reached its second motion, pure compounding, and for one long golden generation, the family understood that their highest duty was to leave it alone. But a fortune that needs nothing from its owners leaves its owners with nothing to do. And money with nothing to do goes looking for a game. In the third generation, it found one, the most elaborate, expensive, beautifully useless game in American history. It found the ballroom. Every fortune, once it no longer needs tending, converts part of itself into something economists have no comfortable name for, so we will simply call it position. Position is what money becomes when it stops buying things and starts buying standing. The deference of a room, the right marriages, the power to decide who is received and who is not. In the New York of the Gilded Age, position governed real things, whom your children could marry, which men would do business with you on a handshake, which doors opened. Position was an asset class. And for about 30 years, the acknowledged central bank of that asset, the institution that issued it, priced it, and could refuse to honor it, was one unhurried woman in a brownstone on Fifth Avenue. Her name was Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. She had been born into the old Dutch aristocracy of the city. The Knickerbocker families, whose money was small but whose names were 2 centuries old, and she had married William Backhouse Astor Jr., a grandson of the fur clerk, in what was, whatever else it became, a perfect merger. The oldest name in New York joined to the deepest rent roll. Her husband preferred his horses and his yacht, and appears in this story hardly at all. Caroline took the combined capital, his money, her name, and built with it the most exclusive institution in America, which was simply her own drawing room. The mechanism deserves a moment because it is the same mechanism we watched in the fur country wearing silk. What Mrs. Astor manufactured was scarcity. With her ally Ward McAllister, a courtly Southern gentleman who served as her chamberlain and enforcer, she let it be known that society was not everyone who was rich. Society was a fixed list. McAllister told a newspaper in 1888 that there were really only about 400 people in fashionable New York, and the number rang like a bell, helped by the story polished ever since, that 400 was what her ballroom could hold. To be inside the 400 was to exist. To be outside it, as the merely wealthy discovered at a cost no ledger records, was to stand in the cold with your millions in your hands. Her annual ball each January was the mint where the currency was struck, and an invitation was the only banknote in America that money could not straightforwardly buy. Notice what this cost the fortune. Almost nothing. The balls, the gowns, the footmen, the 10-course dinners, set against the estate's quarterly river of ground rents, the whole apparatus of social empire cost less, by any reasonable count, than the rents of a few good blocks. Compounding did not pause. That is the elegance of position as the Astors practiced it. The family converted a sliver of income, not capital, into a generation of primacy, while the land underneath went on quietly doubling. A name that had meant pelts and rent collecting now meant to the whole country aristocracy itself, the royal family of New York. But monopolies on position end the way monopolies on beaver end. And if you sat with us on our first evening by this fire, you have already seen the night it happened, from the other side of the street. In 1883, a new fortune, the Vanderbilts, built a white chateau and announced a costume ball and contrived matters so that Mrs. Astor's own daughter longed to attend and could not because the families were not acquainted. The Queen weighed the currency against her daughter's tears, and a footman in blue livery carried her calling card to the chateau door. New York understood the transaction at once. Admission to society had just been undersold. The list would widen, then widen again, and the power to close it was never again what it had been. Caroline Astor held court for another quarter century all the same, magnificent and increasingly alone, and died in 1908, the last monarch of a currency already softening. Position, it turned out, obeyed the same laws as every other asset, scarce, then imitated, then common, then quaint. And within her own family, a generation before her death, one man had already drawn the coldest, most interesting conclusion of anyone. If position was the product, then America, young, mocking, democratic America, was the wrong market for it. Somewhere across the water there was an older exchange, where position came in a form no upstart could counterfeit with a crown on it. His trunks were packed by 1890. He is the subject of our next chapter, the Astor who took the fortune's oldest lesson, buy the real thing at the source, and applied it to nobility itself. There is a very old exchange rate in the world, older than banks, older than most countries, and it runs in one direction. New money buys old standing. The merchant's daughter marries the baron's son. The banker buys the bankrupt abbey. The fortune, in its second or third generation, quietly converts a portion of itself from the newest kind of wealth, cash, rents, securities, into the oldest kind, which is a name attached to land attached to centuries. Economists would call it an illiquid asset with a negative yield. Families keep buying it anyway, century after century, because it is the only asset that answers the question money cannot answer for itself, whether one belongs. The Astor who executed this conversion more completely than perhaps any American ever has was William Waldorf Astor, great-grandson of the fur clerk, and after his father's death in 1890, by some accounts the richest man in America. He was tall, scholarly, thin-skinned, and proud, a writer of romantic novels and a former minister to Italy, and America had bruised him. He had stood for public office and been laughed at in the papers. He had asserted, after his father's death, that his own wife was now rightfully the Mrs. Astor, and lost that small, fierce war of engraved cards to his Aunt Caroline, whose court simply declined to notice the succession. In 1891, he moved his family to England, and he is reported to have said, in words the American papers never let him forget, that America was no place for a gentleman. The papers mocked him without mercy. He never lived here again. Watch now what the fortune did in his hands, because every transaction runs the same direction. In 1893, he bought Cliveden, a great Italianate house above a bend of the Thames, with centuries of dukes and scandals already soaked into its terraces. In 1903, he bought Hever Castle in Kent, a small, perfect, moated castle, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, and restored it stone by stone, filled the moat, laid Italian gardens, and built beside it, for his guests, an entire mock Tudor village, so that the 20th century could visit the 16th in comfort. He bought his way into print as well, a London evening paper, a magazine, and in time the Observer, one of the oldest newspapers in the world, because in England a press lord was a kind of nobleman too. Manhattan ground rent, collected quarterly from grocers and tenement landlords 5,000 miles away, crossed the Atlantic and became moats, yew hedges, Holbein portraits, and column inches. And then the conversion completed itself in the only way it ever truly can. He gave, enormously, and it should be said genuinely to English causes, above all to the war charities after 1914, and honors followed the giving in the old understood rhythm. In 1916, he became Baron Astor of Hever Castle. In 1917, Viscount Astor. The butcher's great-grandson from Waldorf was now a peer of the realm, and his descendants sit in the line of that title still. He had bought the one thing the 400 could never issue, a rank that did not depend on anyone's ballroom. History added its own flourish, the kind no one could have purchased on purpose. His son Waldorf married a quick, fearless Virginian named Nancy, and in 1919 she became the first woman ever to take a seat in the British House of Commons. The American fortune, of all improbable things, a piece of British constitutional history. The English Astors went on to a century of their own, houses, papers, politics, troubles, that belongs to another evening. But for tonight's ledger, the move to England matters for one cold structural reason. The fortunes split. From the 1890s on, there were two Astor fortunes, an English one, converting itself steadily into acres and titles and good works, and an American one, still riding the old Manhattan machine. Remember the third motion of a fortune, the dissolving, and its first and mildest instrument, division. No one in 1900 would have said the Astor money was dissolving. It was merely for excellent reasons in two places instead of one, each half smaller than the whole had been. That is always how it begins. The American half now rested, in effect, on one man, Caroline's son, a builder of hotels and a tinkerer with inventions, the head of the New York line. In the spring of 1912, he was abroad, finishing a long honeymoon, and he booked passage home on a new ship making her first crossing. A fortune of the kind we have been studying is designed above everything else to survive its owner. That is what the trusts are for, and the rule against selling, and the long chain of stewards. On an April morning in 1912, in the gentlest and most terrible way, the design was tested. We will stay, for most of this chapter, on dry land in New York on the morning of April 15th, where the first word arrived by wireless and nobody could tell yet how much of it was true. Crowds gathered in the rain outside the newspaper offices, reading the chalked bulletins as boys carried them out. The great ship struck, the great ship sinking, the great ship safe and under tow, all in the same hour, because the sea gives up its news slowly. Outside the steamship line's office on Lower Broadway, the crowd was quieter, and it did not disperse. And into that office on that Monday came a college junior of 20, a tall, gangling, kind-faced boy named Vincent Astor, asking, like everyone else in the room, for news of his father. The facts, as the survivors later told them, are these, and they can be told quietly, because that is how the night itself seems to have held them. The ship was Titanic, the largest vessel then afloat, 4 days into her first crossing. Late on the night of April 14th, she struck ice far out on the North Atlantic and sank in the small hours of the morning. The sea that night was flat calm. Survivors spoke of it ever after, a black mirror under enormous stars, and bitterly cold. Among the passengers was John Jacob Astor IV, Caroline's son, the head of the American family, and by common reckoning the richest man aboard. His fortune later counted at roughly $87 million. With him was his new wife, Madeline, 19 years old and expecting their child in the summer. Those who were near them in the last hour remembered a composed man. He helped Madeline into one of the last lifeboats and asked the officer evenly whether he might join her, in view of her condition. The officer said no, women and children first, until there were no more women and children within reach. Astor accepted the answer, stepped back from the rail, and was seen in those final minutes standing quietly out of the way. The boat pulled off into the dark with his wife in it. He did not survive the night, and we will leave the night itself there, unwitnessed as the sea left it. Some days later, a cable ship out of Halifax, sent to do the sad work of recovery, found him. He was identified without difficulty, by the initials sewn inside his collar, by the gold watch, by the quiet contents of a gentleman's pockets. The funeral was held in May up the Hudson. The flags in the city stood at half-mast, and the estate office, it was noted, closed for the day one day because rents, like tides, do not observe mourning. And then the machinery did precisely what it had been built to do. The will moved the fortune down the line without a tremor. To Madeline, an income and the use of houses for as long as she remained a widow, a controlling clause common to that age, worth one plain sentence and no more. To the child she carried, a trust waiting for a person not yet born, he arrived that August and was given his father's name. And the great bulk of it, the land, the leases, the machine, somewhere near $70 million of it by some accounts, passed whole to the college boy from the shipping office. The newspapers, with their gift for the phrase that sticks, called Vincent Astor the richest boy in the world. He was 20 years old, and the ship had taken his father in the middle of every plan. He left Harvard within the year and came home to the estate office, to the green ledgers and the quarter days. And there he did something no head of the family had done in quite this way in 100 years. He went out to look at what the fortune actually was. Not the numbers, the buildings, the blocks themselves downtown where the ground rents came from. He walked them. What he found there and what he did about it begins the last long movement of our story, the quiet unbuilding of the oldest fortune in America. No one ruined the Astor fortune. Hold that sentence for a moment because it is in its way the whole evening. There is no crash to tell you about, no swindle, no midnight telegram. There is instead a patient arithmetic, 5 or 6 slow forces, each small in any given year, all pressing the same direction for half a century. We will take them one at a time, unhurried like entries on the far side of a ledger. The first entry is conscience, which is not usually listed among the enemies of great fortunes, but belongs here. Vincent Astor walked his inheritance and did not like what he owned. Whole blocks of the rent roll stood on some of the most crowded tenement ground in the city. Airless rooms, dark stairs, humanity stacked to the rafters, paying its way upward, quarter by quarter, into the estate. He was a restless, practical, decent young man with an uncomfortable amount of power, and he used it. Within a few years of coming into the fortune, he had broken the family commandment. He sold tenement properties by the tens of millions of dollars worth, by some accounts, sold off in great blocks. The never sell rule, kept faithfully for a century, ended there, partly because Vincent's conscience disliked the source of the money, and partly because his judgment, which turned out to be excellent, told him the century of automatic Manhattan compounding was closing. He put the money instead into Midtown, into hotels, into ventures his ancestors would never have touched, ships, aviation, in time a news magazine, and into the pleasures of his position, among them a great white yacht and the friendship of Franklin Roosevelt. The fortune was no longer a sleeping machine. It was awake now and being steered, and a steered fortune rises and falls with its steersman, which is to say it had rejoined the ordinary world. The second entry arrived by mail from Washington. In 1913, the income tax. In 1916, the estate tax. Modest at first, then war came, and the rates climbed to heights the founder could not have dreamed, until by the middle of the century, the top of a very large estate owed most of itself to the government at every death. Recall that the whole Astor design was generational. The fortune passed intact, steward to steward, like a flame cup between hands. The estate tax stood precisely in the path of the handoff. Each death now shrank the machine, once by division among heirs, and once again by taxation, a double subtraction applied at every generation against which no rent roll could compound fast enough. The third entry was written in Albany, and it was of all things protection for the tenants. Out of the wartime housing shortage of the 1940s came rent control, rents on old buildings frozen by law, while inflation, war and post-war walked steadily on. Think of what that meant to the old engine. The ground lease had worked because the land's income rose with the city, automatically, forever. Now, across whole classes of property, the income was fixed by statute, while taxes, wages, coal, and repairs went up every year. The quiet engine, run for a century in one direction, was running in reverse, the owner's costs compounding, the owner's income standing still. The law had its justice. Many of those renters were the very families who had once paid the estate's quarter days from 2 airless rooms. But observe, as pure mechanics, what it did. The city that had made the fortune had rebalanced the old bargain at last. The fourth entry was age, the simple aging of things. The grand Astor hotels of one era became the faded piles of the next, as fashion moved uptown without asking anyone. Buildings, unlike land, wear out, and the fortune now owned many buildings. And the fifth entry we have already met, division. The English half and the American half, then each half divided again among children and cousins and trusts, each stream thinner than the river had been. By mid-century there were many comfortable Astors and no colossal ones, which is not a tragedy of any kind, but is precisely how a great fortune stops being one. Vincent Astor died in 1959, in his late 60s, without children. And his will, when it was read, showed how completely he had understood where the story was going, and had decided in the end to choose its destination. Roughly half of what remained, something over $60 million by some accounts, he left to a foundation he had created years before, dedicated, in the phrase he chose for it, to the alleviation of human misery. And the rest, along with the foundation itself and the whole weight of the name, he left to his third wife, a warm, quick, tiny woman named Brooke, whom he had told, by her own account, that she was going to have a great deal of fun giving it all away. She will close our ledger a few chapters from now. But first, there is one address we have been saving all evening, the most famous address the fortune ever wore, where a family quarrel built the grandest hotel on earth, and a parking problem of history replaced it with the tallest building in the world. We must step back a little way in time for this chapter. The mechanics of a fortune do not always run in calendar order, to a stretch of Fifth Avenue in the early 1890s, at 33rd and 34th Streets, where 2 Astor mansions stood side by side. In one lived Caroline, the Mrs. Astor, Queen of the 400. Next door stood the house of her late brother-in-law's family, inherited by William Waldorf Astor, the proud cousin we last saw packing his trunks for England. Before he sailed, he made one last American decision, and New York has never stopped telling the story. He announced that his mansion, the house standing wall to wall with his aunt's, would be torn down, and that on its site he would build a hotel. 13 stories of hotel, looming directly over the garden of the woman who had denied his wife the crown of society. The city read it, gleefully, as the most expensive act of spite in American history, and perhaps it partly was. But run the numbers, as we have learned to do tonight, and the ledger's version is simpler and colder. A mansion on that corner was position, a hotel on that corner was revenue, and William Waldorf, done with New York position forever, chose revenue. The Waldorf Hotel opened in 1893, German Renaissance marble and turrets, luxurious beyond anything the city had seen. Caroline, unamused, decamped uptown to a new chateau by the park. And her son, John Jacob IV, the gentleman we have already accompanied to the North Atlantic, was left holding the family house beside his cousin's tower of strangers. The cousins were barely on speaking terms. But money has a logic of its own, and the logic said, one hotel beside another is competition, but 2 hotels joined are the largest hotel on earth. So in 1897, he raised the Astoria on his mother's old ground, 4 stories taller than the Waldorf, and the lawyers stitched the 2 buildings into one enterprise with a hyphen, the Waldorf Astoria, on terms that tell you everything about the family and nothing about the hotel. Every connecting corridor was built so that either side could be sealed off, brick by brick, if the cousins ever fell out again. They never needed to. The joined hotel was a wonder, 1,000 rooms, the first great hotel where respectable society went to be seen in public, where where a corridor of mirrors and palms between the two buildings became so famous a promenade that the papers named it Peacock Alley, and where the maître d'hôtel, the story says, first assembled the salad that carries the name Waldorf to this day. For 30 years, the hyphen at 34th Street was the social capital of America, the ballroom of the Republic built out of a quarrel. And then the land itself, one last time, had the final word. By the late 1920s, the neighborhood had turned to commerce, the hotel had grown dowdy, and the ground beneath it, this is the oldest sentence in tonight's story, had become worth too much for the building standing on it. The hotel closed in 1929, the wreckers came, and on that precise spot rose the Empire State Building, the tallest tower on Earth, standing where the ballrooms had been, which is the entire history of Manhattan compressed into a single city block. The hotel's name moved uptown to Park Avenue, into a silver skyscraper of its own, grander than ever. But it was no longer in the old sense the family's. The name had floated free of the fortune, the way great names eventually do, and become a brand, bought and sold among hotel men. By the late 1940s, it belonged, in effect, to Conrad Hilton, an innkeeper's son from New Mexico, who by some accounts had carried a photograph of the Waldorf under the glass of his desk for years, with his ambition written across it, long before he could afford the building. In 1949, he got it. There may be no gentler way to say what had happened to the Astor fortune by the middle of the century. The money was scattered, the land was sold or taxed or frozen, the machine was stopped. What remained, what still filled ballrooms and sold salads and named hotels, was the name. The last stage of a great fortune is the stage at which the name earns more than the money. The Astors had arrived there. And the name had one great bearer left. She was born Brooke Russell in 1902, a Marine officer's daughter, raised in garrison towns and in China, and she came to the Astor fortune late, at 50, by the longest road in this story. 2 marriages already behind her, one unhappy, one dear and cut short. She married Vincent Astor in 1953. He was difficult, solitary, and rich. She was warm, sociable, and as it turned out, tougher than anyone guessed. They had 5.5 years. And near the end, by her own telling, he would speak of the foundation that would one day be hers, and tell her she was going to have fun with it. It was an odd sort of bequest. Most fortunes are left to be kept. This one, explicitly, was left to be spent. What followed was the fortune's last conversion, and the loveliest of them. For nearly 40 years, Brooke Astor gave the money away, deliberately, personally, and in her word and Vincent's, with fun. The sums, counted across the decades, came by some accounts to nearly $195 million, and the method mattered as much as the money. She insisted on seeing things with her own eyes. She went in person, a small, perfectly dressed woman in a good hat and white gloves, well into her 90s, to every corner of the city that asked for help, housing projects in the South Bronx, church basements, branch libraries in Queens, firehouses, community gardens grown in rubble. If you gave me in the Bronx, she liked to explain you went to the Bronx. She understood, a Mrs. Astor to the last, that attention was part of the gift, and where she went, other money followed. She had a saying she loved to repeat, borrowed from an older wit and polished into her own. Money is like manure, piled up. It does no good at all, but spread around, it helps young things grow. It is difficult to think of a sentence that undoes a century of the never sell rule more cheerfully than that one. And the money, as it spread, kept curving back toward one place. The New York Public Library, the great marble building on Fifth Avenue that had been formed at the century's turn out of 3 collections, the oldest and largest of which was the Astor Library, the $400,000 bequest we set aside, chapters ago, in the will of 1848. Brooke gave to many things: the zoo in the Bronx, the great museum on the Park, where the fortune built a Ming scholar's courtyard, one of the quietest rooms in the city. But the library was her love, and it received her money in the tens of millions. In 1997, at 95, she closed the Vincent Astor Foundation. Its work done, its capital spent as designed, and the last great grant went, of course, to the library. She explained the whole philosophy of the ending in one sentence. The money had been made in New York, and it would stay in New York. The fortune's first public act and its very last, a century and a half apart, were the same act, a library, given to the city that had made the money in the first place. She lived on past 100, the last person alive whom New York, without irony, called the Mrs. Astor. Her final years, it is honest to say, were shadowed by a dispute within her own family over her care and her fortune, which the courts in time resolved, and which we will leave, respectfully, folded away. She died in 2007 at 105 years old, and the city that had once counted her family's money in awe now counted, in the obituaries, only what she had given away. There was no crash at the end of the Astor fortune. There was a gift repeated for 40 years until the ledger stood at zero by choice. Of all the ways a great fortune has ever ended, it is difficult to name a better one. Every fortune leaves a residue, and it is almost never money. Let us spend our last few minutes, in no hurry at all, walking through what remains. Because once you know this story, the city is scattered with its fingerprints, hiding in the plainest sight. Take the subway to Astor Place in downtown Manhattan and look at the tiled walls of the station. Set into the old ceramic there are small plaques, and on the plaques of all things are beavers, round, brown, contented-looking beavers, fired into porcelain a century ago. A fur clerk's ledger entry made permanent in the wall of a train station, and hardly one rider in 1,000 hurrying past knows why the beaver is there. That may be the purest monument the fortune has, quiet, half forgotten, and underground, still watching the crowds go by. Across the river sits an entire neighborhood called Astoria in Queens. Its founders named it that in 1839, hoping, by some accounts, that the flattered old man would return the compliment with a generous investment. He sent, the story says, remarkably little. Some tellings make it $500, and the neighbors grumbled, and the name stayed anyway. On menus in 1,000 restaurants, a salad of apples and celery keeps the name of a demolished hotel. On Fifth Avenue, the lions called Patience and Fortitude guard a library that holds, deep in its bones, the Astor Library of 1848, the founder's $400,000, compounded now into one of the great free libraries of the earth, open to any reader who walks in, the only Astor investment still paying its dividend to everyone. The Empire State Building stands on the ground where the ballrooms were. The hyphen it displaced lives on in a hotel on Park Avenue. Uptown, in the museum by the park, the Ming courtyard that Brooke built sits in its permanent dusk, water trickling somewhere out of sight, one of the few rooms in Manhattan where no one has ever been in a hurry. Across the ocean, Hever Castle keeps its moat and its gardens, and Cliveden looks down its long lawn to the Thames, both of them open now to anyone with the price of a ticket. The Viscountcy continues quietly in the old way. And in the hills near Heidelberg, there is still a village called Waldorf, where a butcher's son once decided that the flutes and the furs and the whole improbable wager of America were worth the crossing. The money itself is gone. It went where we watched it go tonight, into the ground rents and out again, into ballrooms and castles and hotels, into the cold sea off Newfoundland, into the treasury at every death, into frozen rents and aging buildings and the branching arithmetic of heirs, and at the last, by one woman's cheerful design, into libraries and gardens, and brick by brick, back into the city that had generated every dollar of it in the first place. The editor of 1848, who wrote that half the fortune belonged by rights to the people of New York, would be interested to learn how the ledger finally settled. It took a century and a half, but the city in the end was paid. And that is the anatomy of a fortune complete, gathered by a watchful man with 7 flutes and a borrowed idea. Compounded for 100 years by a machine of land and patience that worked best when no one touched it. Dissolved by taxes and kindness, by division and time, by conscience and cold Atlantic water, and never once by a villain. Money of that size, we said at the beginning, is a living thing. Living things have lifespans. This one ran about 150 years, which, as fortunes go, is a long and honorable life, and it died warm, in its own bed, giving things away. So let it all settle now, gently wherever it wants to settle. The flutes on the icebound ship, the pelts and the ledger ink, the surveyor's stakes standing in the orchard grass, the quarter days and the green ledgers, the 400 names, the moat at Hever, the flat calm sea under the stars, the beavers in the tile at Astor Place, the lions on the library steps. If you are still awake, you know how a great fortune actually lives and dies now, and it is knowledge that will keep. None of it is required of you before morning. And if you are drifting, half in and half out, letting the words blur into the dark, that is exactly as it should be. The ledgers are closed. The rents are all collected, every last one, and given away again. There is nothing more to keep track of tonight, and nowhere else to be. Thank you for spending this evening with me by candlelight among the Astors and their quiet machine. Sleep well. Good night.